To zombie or not to zombie? That is the question. Oh, wait. That's Romeo Zombies. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out the introduction video. There's a link to it in the description below. It'll give you a pretty good idea of what the Horror Movie Syllabus is all about. Basically, we look at a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. But in this series, our Doctorate Level series, we add a 4th Doctorate Level selection to a subgenre that we've already explored, that we've already picked 3 movies and looked at before. We do a quick recap of what we talked about in that video, and then we add a 4th new, deeper cut or like less common or less mainstream pick for that subgenre. And the subgenre we're looking at today, revisiting, is the Romero Zombie subgenre. And as we explained in the previous video, we split up Romero Zombies from non-Romero Zombies or other zombies because the Romero Zombie movies are so influential on zombie movies in general. He redefined what a zombie was. You know, back in the day, it was like voodoo-controlled people, and it really wasn't this undead rising from the dead wanting to eat brains type thing that it became, thanks in large part to George A. Romero, the most prolific and favorite of the Horror Movie Syllabus directors. If you saw our director video, George Romero was tops on the charts on that one. So we have a lot of love for Romero, and for good reason, because his movies are incredibly influential. Romero Zombies are a large part of what makes the current zombie craze, and throughout decades, zombie craze, the zombie popularity so popular. It's a big reason why there is the social commentary that's tied into zombie movies so much, and the allegories that are driven by the zombie metaphor, if you will. A lot of this, most of this, comes from George A. Romero and his zombie movies. So we, of course, felt the need to give him his own subgenre, because without him having his own subgenre for this, the zombie movies would be excluding everything else that's noteworthy in the zombie subgenre. So we broke it up, and we're glad we did, because it was worth giving a spotlight just for the Romero zombie movies. And that's what we were talking about in the video. And we talked about the 3 most famous ones, and we're going to go ahead and recap those 3 right now. The first Romero zombie movie that we talked about was Night of the Living Dead. And Night of the Living Dead is a bona fide horror classic. We talked about this in the video, and that's why we bent our rule about modern horror being 1970 and later, and this movie came out in 1968. And so we had to bend our rule a little bit, because we had to talk about this movie. It's that influential. It's that important. It basically defines what the modern zombie is in that movie. It's incredibly well made. It holds up extremely well as a movie, and it does have this idea of a progressive attitude towards race in the movie, as having an African-American protagonist. And it really is an interesting, noteworthy movie that remains important to this day. It sets up the rules for the zombie. It sets up the tropes for the zombie. It really has the concepts that we all understand and kind of know as a zombie apocalypse now in that movie. It's really what's setting it all up to be, going forward, the zombie template. So it's definitely important and definitely a must-see. The next Romero zombie movie we talked about was Dawn of the Dead. And Dawn of the Dead is another bona fide classic. And this one is actually my favorite of the bunch. It's really holds up and stands the test of time as well. If Night of the Living Dead set the groundwork for the modern zombie, Dawn of the Dead solidified it with the slow, mindless, lumbering zombie and the allegory for consumerism that it had in there, and all of the tropes that we really think of when it comes to zombies, the eating of the flesh and everything, that really kind of gets solidified and set in stone here in this movie. It's got the Tom Savini makeup effects, which are outstanding and to this day hold up rather well. And it's really just a great, fun movie. In addition to just being a noteworthy and important movie, it's just fun and good. And I mentioned that in the video, that you should just watch it because it's an entertaining and fun movie, but it's also an incredibly important one. And there's also the remake. We talked a little bit about the remake, which we've talked about in other videos too, and how good the remake is as well. But the original really is another must-see horror classic that you need for your horror education. And the last Romero zombie movie on the syllabus we talked about was Day of the Dead. And Day of the Dead is less good than the first two movies, but it's still a good movie. We talked about how it's maybe lesser compared to the two bona fide classics that come before it, but it's still a really good movie and does the best job of explaining the whole, or exploring the whole man is the true monster motif that runs through a lot of these movies, and not just Romero movies, but going forward, the influenced zombies movies that have come out of these. The man is the true monster idea is a very prolific and prevalent theme in those movies. And we talked about how the timeline of this movie, even though because these movies are all interconnected, but they're all set in modern times, and how the contemporary timeline doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense. And that's kind of a fun little Easter egg type thing to kind of have to roll with a little bit. But the movie is challenging. It's asking a lot of interesting questions, and maybe it's not 100% successful in explaining or answering those questions, but it's still making the attempt at some interesting social commentary and interesting ideas that, again, want to be incredibly influential throughout the rest of the throughout zombie movies going forward. So all three of the movies, extremely, extremely important, must-sees, and also really, really good. So that was our exploration into Romero Zombies, but now it's time to look at a fourth doctorate level selection. Our doctorate level selection for the Romero Zombies subgenre is Document of the Dead. Document of the Dead came out in 1981 and was directed by a man named Roy Frumkes, and I'm not 100% sure I'm saying his name right, but he is a film professor at the New York School for Visual Arts, and he was trying to create a teaching film on independent filmmaking, and so he decided to do a documentary about the making of Dawn of the Dead. So it's an interesting time capsule, and it's an interesting behind-the-scenes look at the making of this particular movie and just independent filmmaking in general, but also into George A. Romero. And if you haven't seen it before, the movie is a full documentary, and it's rather short. It's about an hour long, but it got longer as time went on because they added more to it. But it is a behind-the-scenes look at the making of Dawn of the Dead, constituting interviews with George A. Romero and other people, actors and crew and cinematographers that worked on the movie, Tom Savini, for example. And they're telling anecdotes and stories about the making of the movie and what goes on behind the scenes, and a lot about George A. Romero and his filmmaking process, because again, it's trying to focus on independent filmmaking. And it's really an interesting look at that time period, and seeing young Romero, young Savini, and young Foray, and all these actors. And it's just a nice, really cool look at that time period, what was going on behind the scenes. So not hijinks to be talked about in this video. And this is admittedly a little bit different than what we would normally talk about when we talk about Romero Zombies. But I felt like, we had to talk about this movie because it is somewhat important. It's noteworthy for what it is. It's a pretty well-known horror documentary, not so strong that I could actually make it into the horror documentary subgenre that we have, but really important enough that people, especially Romero fans, are very familiar with this and really speak highly of it for a good reason. But the second reason why we had to bring it up here is because, well, there's only so many Romero zombie movies, and we've talked about them all. So it's going to be a little bit interesting what I choose for this doctorate level and the extra credit. But Document of the Dead definitely qualifies here. It definitely is kind of, if you're a Romero fan, it's must see. It is very interesting to see young Romero, talking about his craft, talking about the movie business, talking about, things like, working with, other people and collaborating, and then talking to those other people too, and seeing how the process works, seeing their stories about George in real time. Them talking about him, not later on and whimsically and wistfully remembering him and talking positive about him. It's real time, in the moment, discussions about him. So they're much more honest, and it's not salacious or controversial or anything like that. You're not going to get the tea on this. Really, it's not really like that. It's interesting to see the vibe on the set and the attitudes about the film on the set and about George A. Romero on the set. It's just interesting to see that in real time, in the moment, and seeing how they all talk about him and talk about each other, seeing Tom Savini show you how he does his work, showing how he does his makeup and stuff like that. Fascinating. It's great to see the behind the scenes and the gags on the stunts, Savini doing the stunt work that he was doing at the time. doing all the various makeup effects and stuff like that, and hearing from the horse's mouth, hearing from Savini how it's supposed to go, hearing from George Romero the intent of the movie and some of the stuff he's trying to accomplish, and whether or not he was successful in it, talking about the financing, talking to the producers about the finance, talking about working with Dario Argento, and hearing all this stuff. If you're interested in filmmaking, this is a fascinating watch. If you're just a fan of Romero and the zombie movies, it's also a fascinating watch. It's neat to see the old footage, to see young Romero. We're all very familiar with Romero later on when he would be on camera work and something. He's older and everything like that. But it's really interesting to see young Romero, still idealistic, still kind of full of life and everything. And he looks, frankly, different than what you know him as an older man. And it's just, it's kind of neat footage. It's just neat. It's neat to see these people doing their thing, you know, getting that behind the curtain look. And I'll admit, the documentary itself is not particularly noteworthy as a documentary in itself. It's the subject matter that's interesting, because the documentary is perfectly fine. They have some narrator, and they have like a second narrator that kind of like corrects the first narrator. It's kind of weird. That's the one thing I thought was really interesting, is like there's two different voices talking, and they would kind of correct each other. And bizarre. It was kind of bizarre, but I wish they did more of that, actually. It would have made it a little bit more interesting. But it's a really straightforward, basic documentary about something really fascinating, about the making of a really legendary film. That's pretty cool. I like that a lot. And like I mentioned earlier, the movie's been updated twice. It's a little over an hour long, but they added some additional footage in 1988 and then another in I think 2020 or 2012. And so it gets longer each time that they add to this. And that's cool. It's more cool stuff, you know, but it's less interesting to me because it's not as in the moment. The movie came out in 1981, but it was filmed during the making of the 1978 Dawn of the Dead. So what you're getting at that is a real-time discussion, whereas later on what you're getting is discussions about other movies later on, and it doesn't feel as of the moment, and it feels a little bit like what it is, a little bit like padding. You know, the movie or the documentary already in its original form has a bit of padding. It has a lot of footage of the Romero movies, not just Dawn of the Dead, but also Night of the Living Dead, Martin, and it's making points with that, and points about independent filmmaking and style, especially Romero style. So it's worth it. It's worth seeing that, and it makes sense. But it does feel a little bit like it's a little padded. But I understand why. Because the intent of the movie originally was to be an instructional movie about independent filmmaking, and that's what it's doing. And it's doing it fairly well, if a bit basic. And that's cool. I'm cool with that. And it is interesting to hear the ideas about, you know, Romero's style and stuff like that. And it's cool stuff. If you like film theory and things like that, which I do, that's cool stuff. But the real treat is seeing Romero talk about his stuff, seeing Tom Savini talk about his stuff, seeing the actors talking about their stuff, the producers, the cinematographer, and what they're trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish. It's a treat. It's a real cool thing for, if you like documentaries about horror movies, if you like Romero, if you like Romero zombie movies, Dawn of the Dead, you like Tom Savini's gore work, any of those reasons is a reason to check this movie out. And it goes really quickly. It's a short movie, but it's definitely worth it. It's definitely worth your time. And like I said, it's pretty well known amongst the fans, the zombie fans, Romero fans, things like that. But it's not a super mainstream movie. So it's definitely one to put on your radar if you haven't seen it already. It's worth the time. Check it out. And of course, as always, let me know what you think, because this one, it's not a whole lot to talk about because there's not a lot of meat on the bone in terms of like controversy or anything like that. It's just a really nice, neat peek at a process that I really admire from a man that I really admire, and work I really admire. So let me know what you guys think of that one. So that's our doctorate level selection for the Romero zombie subgenre. But of course, I do have an extra credit selection for you. Maybe not, of course, because like I said, it's a little bit slim pickings at this point, but I think I've got something pretty interesting. If nothing else, it's a pretty good movie. The movie we're talking about for extra credit is Two Evil Eyes. Two Evil Eyes came out in 1990 and is interesting because, yes, I'm stretching here a little bit to get to a zombie motif, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But what's interesting about this is that Romero's not the only director. It's Romero and Dario Argento. And that's super interesting. Now, if you don't know, Argento did produce Dawn of the Dead, so he and Romero had a relationship. So seeing them pair up is not necessarily out of the blue, but it does sound a little out of the blue, and it sounds like a really interesting thing to have these two guys directing a movie together. And it is, but not maybe in the way you're thinking, but we're going to get into all of that in just a second. Now, if you haven't seen the movie before, the movie is kind of an anthology. It's two separate stories that are put together, and they're both based on Edgar Allan Poe works. The Romero half of the movie is based on the facts of the case of M. Valdemar, and the Argento part is based on The Black Cat. And both of these master storytellers tell a Poe story in their own way, kind of, but I won't spoil that too much. Well, I will, but we're going to talk about it in a few minutes. But it really is interesting to see the hijinks abound from these modern contemporary filmmakers, these horror masters, based on an Edgar Allan Poe classic stories. Now, I'm avoiding specifics, obviously, because I'm not trying to spoil the movies for you. But if you're familiar with the stories, you're kind of already a bit of spoiled, I guess, because they're following them. But they're really kind of like inspired by. So neither of them really adhere to the Poe stories terribly closely. They're both modernized versions of them. And it's interesting because Poe may not be the most obvious fit for either of these directors. I would maybe argue that Romero is a little bit more of the successful of the two in terms of translating Poe, but neither of them does it really feel like it's really quite in their wheelhouse. Like I said, Romero did The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, which I've never read before, and I wasn't as familiar with it, but the story does make sense a little bit for Romero because it has a bit of a creep show feel to it. The way he did it, it has a bit of a creep show feel to it. It's got Adrienne Barbeau in there, which horror fans are, of course, very familiar with her. She's pretty famous as a scream queen. And it isn't exactly a Romero zombie. It does deal with like a reanimation of the dead, but it's almost a little bit more of the traditional zombie, like voodoo zombie. Not voodoo zombie, but it's closer to that than it is to the Romero zombie. So again, putting it here is a little bit of a stretch, but it's really basically the closest I can get to a Romero zombie with the remainder of Romero's work. So I'm making it work, but it is reanimated dead. It is interesting to see this nefarious plot of this woman who's married her rich husband and is trying to basically take all his money and is being aided by the doctor, and there's hypnosis involved. And it's interesting because thematically it really is capturing what I understand to be the Poe work. I did some research after the fact, and it is kind of in theme. It's in step with the themes, but it is a modernized version that goes a little bit farther, but it works. Again, in a kind of a creep show way, which was Romero's movie, it does work, and it does make sense that he would be filming it and making this movie in this way. It tracks. It works. Argento, on the other hand, is interesting because for a large part of his version of Black Cat, it feels very not Dario Argento. If I showed it to you, you would never guess. You would never guess it was him. It doesn't have any of his trademark stylistic flourishes or any of his weirdness or incongruous stuff and just that kind of surreal atmosphere until it does. At some point, the story does take a turn. You've got Harvey Keitel playing this photographer, and his girlfriend brings in a cat, and he doesn't like the cat, and he kills the cat, and there's a whole thing. I don't want to spoil too much, because if you're not familiar with the story, Black Cat, then you don't know where it's going. I'm going to try to leave that alone, but if you are familiar with it, you know where it goes. Generally speaking, like I said, the movie's a modernized version of this, and it takes a little bit of liberties with it, but there is a part in the movie, and it's kind of shown almost like a dream sequence, where it gets super Argento. Like it really, well, not super, but it gets very Argento. It gets very weird. It gets very weird. So you go from non-Argento style, very kind of, I wouldn't say road directing because it's solid, but it doesn't really have any of the panache or style that you're used to with Argento, to something that feels very out of place and kind of Argento-esque, at least to some degree, very strange and dreamlike and bizarre and weird and hard to explain. And it works. It works really well, and I enjoy it. Again, you're feeling like, kind of a creepshow vibe from that too. Or really maybe a better way of saying is that they've taken these Poe stories and they've kind of translated them in a way that makes it feel more like episode from Tales from the Crypt. It feels kind of like that. There's this irony, this kind of dark irony to both stories, which Poe's work kind of has a lot of that kind of stuff in it. And it does. It translates well to a Tales from the Crypt style, ironic twist ending. That's kind of what this feels like. And it's done fairly well. And they've done a lot to, both Argento and Romero have done a lot to make these work in a modern way. They've got music that, honestly, it kind of evokes a little bit of Hitchcock. It's got, a little bit of Hitchcock feel to the plots, to the direction, to the music. And, I guess, I don't know, is that modern? It's more modern than Poe, I guess. But it feels contemporary. It feels good. And the contemporary settings work for me rather well. This is not an amazing movie. It's not going to blow your socks off. In fact, I think a lot of people probably don't really have any strong opinions about this movie or haven't even seen it. But it's noteworthy. It's noteworthy because it's two powerhouse master filmmakers making, adapting the work of one of the greatest horror writers ever. That's noteworthy. It's worth checking out. Manage your expectations. They're nothing revolutionary here, nothing revelatory here, nothing that's going to knock your socks off. But it's solid. It's fun. If you like a Tales from the Crypt type thing, a Creepshow type thing, this was for you. This is going to work for you pretty well. If you like Poe, I don't think you'll be disappointed in the way that the stories go, the way that they're told. If you're big Romero Argento fans, I don't think this is going to blow you away, but I think you'll be able to appreciate looking at the work through their lens and what they're not doing that you would normally expect them to be doing. That's probably the more interesting thing about this, is kind of seeing what you think of them when you think of their work and seeing what they restrain from doing in these works. Pretty interesting stuff. I like this movie. I think it's a lot of fun. It's a fun diversion. It's not deep. It's not anything like that. But knowing the pedigree behind it and all of the horror bona fides on it makes it super fascinating to me from a kind of a meta angle. So I find this to be super interesting. I don't know. What do you guys think? Have you seen it? If you've seen it, let me know if you think it's interesting. But if you haven't seen it, it's worth your time. Check it out and then come back and let me know what you think. Because, again, super interesting pedigree. Pretty cool movie, pretty fun, and admittedly stretching the Romero Zombies motif, but what am I going to do? That's where we're at. So that's going to be it for our Romero Zombie revisiting, our doctorate level selection. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. I enjoy it because I love me some Romero, clearly because he pops up in on the syllabus so frequently. And yeah, these are good movies. I enjoy them. I think they're fun. I think they're worth talking about and shining a bit of a light on them. But now it's time to shine a light on a horror trivia pursuit card. It's that time where I'm going to answer a question live on camera. And since we're talking about Romero Zombies, let's do the monster category. It seems obvious enough. Here's our question. What is the name of the hunchbacked assistant of Dr. Frankenstein in 1931's Frankenstein? You bet I know the answer to this. And it's kind of funny that I know the answer to this because I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint here. The answer is not Igor. And that is the answer that I think most people would obviously pick, is Igor. And up until recently, I might have done the same thing, but I've been revisiting Universal Monsters in the not too distant past, and in particular Frankenstein. And part of why it was so a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. I was doing a video for work, a training video for work, and we decided to do kind of a Frankenstein parody type thing, and I played Dr. Victor Frankenstein for obvious reasons. And my buddy, my colleague played the assistant, the hunchbacked assistant, who is not Igor. And to be fair, we actually really didn't completely parody 1931's Frankenstein so much as we did Young Frankenstein. And so it would be Igor. He was really kind of doing an Igor thing, but it wasn't, that's not the answer either. Igor, neither of them are the answer. That's my one clue to you guys. But the reason why I knew that is because I had revisited the movie for this little project we were doing at work, which came out pretty good. And I was a little surprised, and I kind of looked into it. I was like, oh, this is funny. This is one of those things that everybody kind of remembers wrong about this. And it makes sense why the name is the way it is, but it is just kind of an interesting little trivia because it's a good kind of trick question. And I kind of, I helped you avoid the trick by letting you know that it's not Igor, but what is it? Do you know? I do know, so I'm about to answer, so lock in your answer. My answer is Fritz. The name of the hunchback assistant is Fritz. Later on in the series, in the Frankenstein series, you get Igor, Igor. but Fritz is in the first original movie. It's Fritz. Let me just double check. Fritz. It is Fritz. Yeah, like I said, because I've been really digging into that stuff lately, that I remember that. For a long time, I would have been wrong about that. I would have said Igor. How many of you would have said Igor before I warned you not to? Let me know, because I'm betting a lot of you would, and I think that's kind of why the question was, why it exists. They wanted to get you to get it wrong. So I wasn't going to let that happen because you guys are my friends. But what did you answer? If you didn't answer Igor, what did you answer? I'd be curious to know. Did you say Peter Lorre? Because that's kind of funny. Let me know what your answers were if they were funny. And yeah, let me know what you think of these Romero movies. If you haven't seen them before, they're worth checking out. One of them wasn't even directed by Romero, so again, I'm stretching things a little bit, but these are movies that deserve to be checked out. And so let me know what you think of them, and let me know what you think of Romero Zombies in general. Do you think they're as influential as I think they are? Do you like them as much as I do? I'm guessing a lot of you, if you like zombies, you probably like these movies, but let me know if you don't. Be interested to have that conversation. Anyways, until next week, we have another video. I'm just going to wrap this one up by saying, class dismissed.